All right. So 128 attendees. I am so thankful that everyone tuned in for this. So what I'm going to talk about is a process-based framework that I developed that I think will lead to not only stronger solutions, but a whole range of benefits across transformations. So let me start with some stats. So obviously I wrote the kind of the course description of this was based on requirements, but in general, this is an industry known stat that 70% of transformations fail. The global spend for transformation programs is expected to exceed $3.4 trillion. That's a massive amount of money. 40% of project failures are attributed to poor requirements, and it's estimated, I know there's an international crowd here, but it's estimated that poor requirements cost US companies $30 billion, dollars, and I assume that translates everywhere else. So, what are some of the challenges? And I'm sure everyone has felt the pain of some of this and can probably add to this list. But it's inadequate stakeholder involvement, insufficient domain knowledge, ambiguous language, poor documentation and traceability, and then lastly, poor change control process. And I'll tell you this in my experience, it's probably been decades of these challenges, and nothing comes along that addresses this, and I don't see anything coming along that will address this. Hopefully, my solution is the one that comes and tackles this big challenge. So a little bit about what I'll talk about today, and I put the change journey in here because I'm not just going to focus on requirements. I'm going to talk about everything from change, from defining your strategy to understanding what your scope is and allocating funds for your portfolio, all the way through the change process. This will be an introduction. This is a very heavy topic, and I could spend days talking about it in very discrete detail. But I just want to give you an introduction to it so that you could understand kind of that there's a new way to think about how to tackle this. So some of the topics I'll cover. So my root cause of why those failures occur, to me, those were just the symptoms I read through. Why I think alignment is critical for success. And I'll talk about what that means and how you get to alignment. This is a process-based framework, so you're going to have to create models and then do some data integration to understand the environment holistically. I'll talk about how this solution can strengthen business analysts and really everyone that has a role within driving change for their organizations. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit broader about how I believe this solution addresses virtually all transformation needs. So I want to start with this slide because I think if there's one thing you take away from this discussion, it's this, that I think a paradigm shift is needed in how we think about process. So the conventional wisdom or thinking about process is it's a topics for us to understand how processes work so that we could optimize, rationalize them, and just make processes better. To me, the topic process means so much more. It is the connective tissue that ties everything, all organizational knowledge together for how your organization works. So, and if you think about it logically, you do not hire, say, an accountant unless you have a need to develop a finance process to deliver books. You don't get accounting software unless you have that need for the process. So everything starts with what is the business need or what is the process. It is the key for unlocking organizational knowledge. It provides a common language to facilitate alignment across a whole diverse range of stakeholders within an organization, and it connects the dots for clear understanding. A lot of organizations, knowledge is kept in a very small number of subject matter experts. And this is a way to unlock all that knowledge, make it democratized, and really drive an innovative organization. So what this diagram on the right shows that if you take process, you could link out to what are my products and channels, what's my enterprise architecture, and how am I designing my IT environment? What are my vendors, and what are they doing for me? And are they providing the right controls that I need? What's my org, and how do my people align to what processes I deliver, et cetera, et cetera. I like to use the analogy of Google Maps. So Google Maps is a massive data integration project if you think about it, because there's traffic data, there's restaurant ratings, there's satellite imagery, there's on the ground imagery, and so much more. But it all has to resolve to what Google calls the ground truth, which is everything in their data integration has to resolve to the ground truth, which to them, obviously, is the physical environment. Now, if we take that same stance here, ground truth for organizing and detailing all operational knowledge, the ground truth has to be process. And I think it takes us into a new era in that, I've talked a lot in some of my podcasts and posts and whatnot, that digital transformation, the definition of it is really a profound change in how an organization operates or delivers value for their customer, leveraging new technologies like automation, AI, et cetera. I think there's another definition that I want to put forward, which is getting to digitals is all about understanding all the dots and how everything connects in your environment so that you could drive your organization to true agility so that you could respond to changes in the external environment in a much more rapid fashion. So it's to me, I think it's the future, and hopefully you find that as well. So a little bit about me. So who am I? So I spent most of my career in consulting and in the financial services industry. So started my career 13 years at Accenture, 2 at Bank of America. In that time, I was very heavily technology focused. So I started as a Java C++ programmer. I was a solution architect. I led large kind of development programs. I didn't know what the business did. I knew I needed to get my code on delivered on time without defects, et cetera, et cetera. I was always curious, but I had no path to really understand it. Then I joined Ernst & Young, and I spent 10 years there. One of my first projects there was developing a business capability model for a large bank. To me, it was an epiphany moment. So, you could see everything that this bank does in one page, kind of, you could go navigate it 3 levels deep. But it really laid out every single thing that the business did. And to me, I spent all my career in to that point beyond what I call fighting the gremlins of chaos. So I'm sure you guys have all seen it where leadership's not clear on what they want from a transformation or project. Teams don't understand what they're doing. Plans are unclear and kind of a chaotic mess. And to me, this felt like the solution. So I dedicated the rest of my time at Ernst & Young. And then later I became head of process excellence for the US retail bank at Citi. But I dedicated myself to really understanding this topic, testing it out in more transformation situations, because I believe that this is the solution to so many challenges that plague organizations. So I left the corporate world in March of 23, and I wrote my book, which is Digital Transformation Success. You can find it on Amazon, but and I'm not trying to sell you a book. I'm trying to sell you a concept. If you like the concept, then well, buy the book. But I'll glance through a lot of these topics. But if you really want to know the details, it's all within that book. Oh, so what is the root cause? To me, complexity. So our organizations are very complex with people, process, technology environments. Changing things takes multi-years, multi-programs, a significant budget. All of these diverse teams have unique languages and perspectives. And that's why I love the famous tree swing cartoon, because it just illustrates, how the customer explained it and how the programmer wrote it. And I won't read this verbatim, but we all these different roles come to the table with different perspectives. And then they hear, so a business person talking to a technology person, what is said and what is received by that technology person isn't going to be what was intended. So we need to create a way to bridge some of these communication gaps. And I think, ultimately this is the root cause. And for an organization driving significant transformational change, I think it's, the 70% failure rate. I think the 30%, why they succeed is because they have transformation leaders that have superhuman capability. Well, that obviously does not scale. So what is the key to success? To me, it's alignment. So what is alignment? Alignment is everyone in the organization is working towards what you're trying to achieve in your transformation or your change program. And there's 2 parts of that. Your vertical alignment, so alignment from the C-suite all the way down to individual contributors, that everyone knows their role and how they contribute to change in a very precise way. And then there's horizontal alignment. So from business, technology, risk, operations, everyone understands kind of what their specific role is, and they're efficient and effective in doing what they need to do to drive this change. So to get to alignment, to me, and I wrote it this way, but in a real, tangible way. And I know there's probably been, you could probably find, McKinsey, BCG, Boston Consultant articles galore about how to get to alignment, but it's all very kind of soft if you, from my perspective. But to get to real, tangible alignment, you need a common language.
Hey,
So,
Michael, got a first question here, which is an
okay.
interesting one. So, how is this different from the business architecture practice, which
No,
also focuses on alignment of the different processes of the corp?
I love it. So, I actually have a slide that I was going to address in this, but it's a great discussion topic. So to me, and I have been a member of the BA Guild. I know the BizBach very well. BizBach is very light. The center of the BizBach world is capability models, but it doesn't really tie to process. And to me, a capability model is a great representation, a high level of what a business does, but it's abstract in that it doesn't cover the different unique instances of what a business does. And I think that tie between capability and process is really important to get right so that you could have that precision of what the organization does. Hopefully that addresses your question, Milo, and we'll certainly dig into that a little bit more, but I think it's to me, it's not an either or business capability model versus process inventory. It's both. Okay, great. So, okay, to get to alignment, you need a common language. So if you think about what is a criteria if you're going to define a common language, first it has to be business oriented because you have to drive change for what is important for the business, how it adds value, and for what it means to customers. It's got to represent different levels of granularity. So useful for someone in the C-suite defining your strategy, all the way down to the developer, tester, individual contributor that has to make things happen on the ground. It has to be useful for all of that. It has to facilitate cross-functional collaboration, as I talked about. Business and IT and risk and data and all these teams have to work together efficiently and effectively. And then last, it has to capture the idiosyncrasies of each organizational unit. And when I say that, so I came from large banks, and there would be a lot of processes that occurred in different business units. The same process. So you can in large banks, you can open an account in credit cards and the retail bank and mortgage and wealth management, et cetera. We need to represent all of those because those may most likely use different technologies and different people and different vendors and different um, um, risk profiles, et cetera. You need to have that understanding if you're going to drive commonality or even a different understanding of how the organization works. So to me, and I've thought about this extensively, the only candidate that satisfies these criteria is process.
Hey, Michael, another question for you.
Yes.
It asks, isn't capability more like a bundle of required processes, org role structure, business rules, data?
No, so this is a good segue here because I actually put in here that this concept leverages business architecture, process management, et cetera. So business architecture, specifically business capabilities, ability models are an abstract concept. And what I mean by that is you'll have something like account opening or manage payments. It'll be represented once, regardless of how many times it's represented in your organization, which is great if you want to understand what your business does so that you could focus on investing in the key capabilities that are critical for your business success. But ultimately, to make that real, that abstract concept has to be tied to something tangible in the real world, and that is process. And one capability could be satisfied or enabled by numerous processes within the environment. So hopefully that addresses that. The what's important about this is, you know, there's multiple ways, there's different models out there to describe what an organization does. And it's important to have a kind of all these used together, but tied to in a way that you're creating one unified model of the organization that you can inspect from different levels of analysis. So to me, the core of this is process inventory and capability models. And I mentioned those are both really important. Um, but it describes what the business does. And then you could navigate below that to describe how those processes work and what metadata is used to it. So that's kind of how you get all organizational knowledge. But you can navigate that up because, in my view, process inventory is organizationally aligned, as I mentioned with the banking example. But from an end-to-end perspective, your customer journey and your value stream, those cut across organizational boundaries. So you need to that end-to-end is important too. But if you could tie those two together, now I know, and especially if I'm doing a customer journey, I could tie it together of who my customer is, what do they value, what is their journey, and then how do I tie it to the processes in my environment so that if I have a challenge with a customer experience or an end-to-end value stream, I could very quickly get to the root cause. And then obviously this ties to the why in the organization. So the mission, vision, strategies, goals, and tactics, et cetera. But really everything needs to tie together in one cohesive model that describes everything your organization does, with multiple levels of analysis. So David, I assume you're going to jump in if there's anything more.
Yeah, keep rocking and rolling.
All right. So there's two parts of process inventory. First is modeling, which I mentioned. The second is integrating data. So there is a lot of our organizations are flush with data about how they work. But that data is stored in unconnected data repositories that describe different angles. So everyone's got a repository, a list of what technologies they support. Everyone has an HR system that describes their people and their teams and who does what. Many organizations have risk repositories. They have vendor repositories. They have product catalogs, data models, et cetera. Well, but all that's unconnected. And if you're trying to understand how one thing works, you're going to have to go to those various sources and spend a lot of time connecting it all together. But in this new way, you want to take that data and you want to co-locate it with process inventory is a process taxonomy. You want to co-locate it with your process taxonomy, and then now start doing associations between specific processes and the data elements within them. And you can see in this diagram below that, I have a system repository. Well, I want to associate the system called credit. So I'm going to load that into my system library. And then I want to associate a system called credit request to the activity that it supports called send quote. Now, what that does is it creates one repository that really makes all organizational knowledge transparent to anyone. So no longer a small number of SMEs know everything the organization does. It's really transparent to everyone. And that cuts the time from investigating a problem way down so that now teams can focus more on how do you solve problems as opposed to understanding what the environment does. Here, and this talks a little bit about capability model versus process. So I'll touch on that a little bit more. But one thing that I think is important, especially in the age of AI. So AI is going to start to take our mundane and repetitive tasks away from us, and it'll move the workforce into more of a cognitive and critical thinking type workforce. That may sound like a threat, but I think it's an opportunity for organizations specifically that use this to drive a new culture within their environment. And the new culture, there's different innovation models like democratized innovation. And democratized innovation really is the foundation of it is everyone has expertise in what they do. So if you want to drive lasting change within the organization, you need to tap into that knowledge and promote a culture where people can test new ideas. They can experiment and they're rewarded for initiative. And there's an understanding that failure will happen, but there's going to be progress through that failure. So, in this whole constructing the process inventory, there's ownership at different levels because I don't just own a process. My boss also owns that process and his boss owns that process. But in this way, and I phrased it the process dictionary versus the thesaurus, and both are really important. So from a dictionary perspective, I need to define every single process that each business unit does. And that's my dictionary. But then my thesaurus is needed, and this is where a abstract business capability model comes into play, or a abstract APQC common process model. But now I want to tie those things together. So in this example, open account, onboard client, set up customer, those are different named processes. But at the end of the day, I really mean account opening. So now I can assign a global process owner, and that global process owner can drive efficiencies and standardization and everything that they do. The one thing that I think the process inventory ownership does that has been missing in this environment it defines accountability from a day-to-day operation perspective. So now it's much more clear who owns what, not only for change, but just running the business. And then you could see this also extends to different other owners. So if I'm tying together my application, my risk, my vendors, I can now say, okay, for this account open account process, I know all the people's names that are accountable for that. So if I need to change that open account, I could be very precise with who needs to do what. So hopefully that illuminates more on the my view on process inventory versus capability model.
Hey, Michael, question.
Yeah.
Doesn't reference data act like the glue enabling one aspect of common language?
You'd have to elaborate on what reference data is. Um,
All right, so
yeah.
Stephanie, if you can add your thoughts and chat on that. And then Christina asks, isn't that just a racy chart? How does it differ?
It's a great question. So it differs in that it starts with the a platform of complete, because now I know every single process that happens within an environment. Now I know all the processes, and I could be very clear on what my RACI is. So you could still have the accountability that I define here, and you could elaborate on all the, the C's and the I's, et cetera, within RACI. So they very much work together.
All right, go for it, brother. Keep
All
going.
right. So how do you construct this? So when I say your process inventory has to be a complete representation of every process that happens in your environment, you have to anchor to something that's complete. And and to me, one thing that is complete is your org hierarchy, because you hire people to do everything that your organization needs to do. So this requires an interview process, and you start at the top of the hierarchy and you just ask a simple question. What is it that you do? And then you ask their teams, what do they do? And you ask their teams, what do they do? But when you do that, you get their answers, and you take it and you transform it into verb, noun, process names, so that I can have a full document of all the processes that happen within an environment. And then I go back up the hierarchy and I ask people to formally attest. I get an email, I use a workflow, but I get people on record that yes, this is a complete and accurate representation of their business. And when I finish that, ultimately take it to the leader. Now I know that this business stands behind what I represent as their processes. So this is very important to get to complete. Um, okay. So just to take this.
Before you jump in, what process modeling language do you recommend for detailed process definition?
I love BPMN 2.0, but I know there's others out there, EPC, and I think you could use any process language that you want. I personally like BPMN 2.0 because to me it's intuitive. With the swim lanes, I know what actors are doing. It's just very clear language, and it seems to be the industry standard.
All right, then how are outsourced organizations and deliverables handled in this model?
I love it. I still think you need to inventory what your outsource providers do. Now, you may not be able to understand the details of what they do. And in BPMN 2.0, there's a concept of white box and black box process modeling. So they may not contractually have to share what they do, but I at least need to know what processes they're performing on my behalf, because I am still accountable and responsible for what they do. And there's been a lot of data breaches, Equifax, Home Depot, et cetera, where their vendors didn't have good data security. And ultimately the fine was paid by the main organization. So you need to understand what your vendors are doing, especially in an outsourced model, so that you could hold their feet to the fire to prove that, okay, do you have the right controls, and demonstrate those controls for me.
All right, Jennifer says, I have completed the entire exercise using APQC and BPMM for a Fortune 1000 manufacturer. So
Great.
Tom asks, so we need to know what they do, but not necessarily how they do it.
To me, what they do is more important, but there are a lot of cases where you need to know how they do it. So tying that together, and the processes define that your bounded scope for what processes you document. So both are important, and this model supports it absolutely.
All right, keep it rocking.
All right. So just to take it out of the theoretical, I created a process inventory for my company, Process Inventory Advisors. And as you can see, these are the things that my company does. So I do consulting services, which means I engage prospects, I create proposals, I identify resources, I deliver consulting services. I do training, which is I conduct webinars like this. I promote process inventory, which is I publish articles and I post on LinkedIn and I'm a guest on a lot of podcasts, et cetera. But hopefully this shows you that, APQC business capability models are great, but ultimately at the end of the day, you need to get to very specific level of detail of what your business does, and that is how you're going to get to alignment. All right. I'm going to touch on this. This I
Wait,
could
I got
spend,
questions. I got questions. I
yes.
couldn't move my chat. I mean my mute fast enough.
Love it.
So Judy, first off, I mean Michael, first off, Judy asks, what tools do you recommend to house and maintain this information?
Great question. There's a lot of great tools out there. Software AG, Eris, GB Tech, iGraphics, Signavio. I think Salonis has a process modeling capability. There's a lot of great tools out there. Yeah, so that's the good news. And these tools have excellent capabilities. They have workflow. They now integrate AI. They have great reporting. They have great dashboards. Everything that you need. The good news, it's out there.
So going back to reference data equals company, BU, org, ISO, code, client, product, user, etc.
I view that as all metadata. So if you could get an understanding of what your processes are, now you could integrate that metadata, and now you could slice and dice your environment to say what processes belong to this BU, what processes belong to this legal entity, or whatever you need to do. That's pretty critical.
All right. Keep going. No more questions at this
Okay,
point.
so I just want to touch on this. Like I mentioned, I could spend hours on this, but ultimately, if you're going to do this, and if you're going to do this at scale, and if you need to do this for a lot of use cases, then you're going to have to build a process capability to create this information and manage it over time. That means creating standards, et cetera. So there's whole playbooks that I've developed for organizations, but you really need to think about why are you doing it? What is your strategy? What does your organization need? What's the value proposition? You need to define all your models, your quality standards, how all of these dots connect that I mentioned in the integrated framework, the value case definition. So now that you document what your processes are, how are you going to use it to drive value within your organization? You need to understand and document your operating model. So what does it mean within your process? And I call it process COE in some cases, but your process COE, your process capability. What are the roles within that team? And then what are the roles external? Like what is a role of a process owner, a value stream owner, et cetera, et cetera. Being very clear on what this means for the organization is important. Tooling, I just mentioned all the tools, but being very clear on what tool you're using. Is it fit for purpose? And then how are you using it so that you're getting the right value? Change management training, and then delivery planning. So getting all of this, it's not just, you really need to think through what this means for you so that you can implement the strategy right. All right. So one of the things, so documenting processes is important, but ultimately it's just for posterity's sake, unless you change ways of working within the organization to benefit from it. So I've created this map, and to me, these are the main or major use cases. So I have a process inventory. I have clarity on how my organization works. Now, what am I going to do with it? So it's cases from strategy to impact. So defining, leadership at the C-suite may create a strategy which is maybe not clear, maybe a little bit vague. So taking that strategy and mapping it to the specific processes within the organization so that you could understand what exactly has to change. And you could get more objectivity in your portfolio planning process. So you're putting the right dollars into what actually has to happen. Managing your transformation. So from defining your transformation strategy, creating your roadmap, managing the entire journey, the change process. And I'll cover this more in subsequent slides, so I won't dig into this here. But how are you using this common language to drive change within your organization? Operational excellence. So people are probably familiar with Lean Six Sigma. To me, it's focused on, one or two or a handful of processes and how you optimize and address inefficiencies within those processes. But what if you could take a 30,000 foot view level and say, where do I have waste and inefficiencies? Should I even be doing certain processes, or should I move them to a shared service centers? Should I outsource them? It allows you the data you need to ask and answer those critical questions before you're getting into the lower level details. I think this helps enterprise architecture design. So if I give the IT and the enterprise architects more detailed information about what the business does, then they could create a better IT environment that captures that aligns with the business needs, but then is more agile in the case of a rapidly changing external environment. And then lastly, risk management. So I came from banking, which was one of the most heavily regulated industries around. I believe this is the solution to tackling a lot of banking challenges. But really what process inventory does is it gives you clear business context for what your business does so that you could align all your three lines of defense, which is the business, kind of each of the risk type has leadership there, and then the internal audit of what the business does. And then they could do full and complete risk assessments across all risk types. And then they could get clear internal management reporting to senior leadership, and then they could get clear reporting to external regulators on how the organization is running. So this is very, very critical to think about as you kind of start the strategy.
So question here is, Razvan says, in BPM and BPM2 processes can be executed, right?
Yes. Yeah. You could certainly translate those into executable language and put them in your automation or whatever you need to do, for sure.
Okay, great. Keep it rocking, brother.
All right. So I won't drain this slide, but I just wanted to cover a little bit of, and this may not even be exhaustive, but if you implement the strategy, if you're clear on the use cases and how they're being used, you could expect a lot of change from some of these metrics in terms of, greater innovation. I talked about the democratized innovation, better engagement for your customers, stronger risk management. You could optimize costs and resources within your environment. You could have an effective ecosystem and hold your external vendors accountable for what they need to do to serve your needs. Okay, so I want to cover a little bit about from strategy to impact. I touched on this before, but from a strategy perspective, and I put this kind of main chain in the middle here, but what is a strategy? So organizations start with a mission, or what is their purpose? Why do you exist? And then from there, they develop a vision. And that vision is always there because you never quite arrive. You're always advancing to a next goal. That, for the most part, is relatively stable. But I show in here there's the whole SWOT analysis. You could, assess the internal environment from strengths and weaknesses, and then the external environment using the PESTEL framework for political, economic, social, technological, environmental, legal, and then your Porter's five forces framework to understand your competitive landscape. That will ultimately land you with a strategy, which ultimately just means what do we need to do to get there? And that can mean anything. That could be new business models. And with digital transformation, there's new business models like your subscription models and your e-commerce models and your platform models, et cetera. It can be mergers and acquisitions. It can be technology investment. It could be operational excellence. It can mean 1,000 things. But then taking that strategy that can be somewhat vague and then getting very precise on what processes have to change is critical. But then now I could define my work effort for my programs, projects, work streams, getting down to what each and every individual needs to do to advance that cause. I have a friend and a former coworker that worked at a large technology company, and he always said, "Oh, leadership says, we've got to be SaaS first." And he's like, "Well, I don't know what that means." And to me, that means something different for the marketing staff. It means something different for the sales staff, for the engineers, product support, et cetera, et cetera. So now if you could take that and say, okay, what processes exactly need to change to get there, then that's going to be very critical for driving this change in a streamlined manner.
So question, Michael. And Bobby has this question. Seems
Great
like
question.
work effort is waterfall-ish. How would
Yes.
you adapt Is it esk? It's ish, waterfall-ish.
Waterfallish, yeah. Waterfallish, yeah. Sorry.
How would you adapt this if your focus is on product management, not project program management?
So this is a great question, and I write about this extensively in my book. This works for both. So in the agile way, it's a small team that is that doesn't really know the solution, and they're kind of iterating until they figure it out. But I've seen large programs where have a lot of agile teams that have to work together. But how do they work together if they don't coordinate where the dots connect and where processes intersect, et cetera? So I think you could still take this approach. And in fact, I think it's imperative you take this approach so that you could tie it to what it means for the business, but then still leave room for how you execute all your agile functions. So
So you
I
do the
don't.
work, you do the work iteratively, but you plan using this model. You have a
You plan
detailed
using this
model,
model
and then you
exactly.
do the iterative work necessary, right?
Exactly. And you still tie it back to what your business does. So absolutely. These are great. I love the questions. Um,
None right now. Keep rocking.
all right. So okay, so from the the change process. So I think that if you have a common language of what processes are in your environment, now I could be very specific in how I drive this, and I could use that common language throughout all of my deliverables. So I start with project charter, which is really identifying what is my scope. And that's really what processes are in scope for my given change. And I could use something like a heat map. But now when I do that, and I've done all my work to do the data integration of aligned ownership, now I have process owners for each of those that your product managers or your business can work with. Now, and I know all the impacts of technology and risk and everything that comes along with the metadata through it. I could do my future state process design or your target operating model design, which is thinking through, okay, how does this change my process environment? There'll be processes that have to change. There'll be processes that are eliminated. There'll be new processes. And then what comes with that is all your technology people, vendors, and everything else that needs to support it. Just one quick story. So I was involved in a merger of two regional banks, and this is in my consulting days. But we created a process inventory for the combined organization. They already made decisions on what technology they were going to use, what people, et cetera. But we created this process inventory that really tied it together that said, okay, here's the new process environment. We did it for 8 lines of business. And then they use that to drive requirements for everything else downstream for the project. So that clarity, I think, was very important for them to get. I already mentioned better requirements, and that is waterfall and agile. I really believe that everything ties to what your business does. Control design, as I mentioned, I came from financial services. It's very important. So this kind of represents a shift left. So getting your whole risk operating model, your 3 lines of defense, kind of engaged earlier in your project, so they could look at what you're building, they could do an assessment of risk, and they could give you requirements for what controls you need to build into your platform, or if it's a people control, what needs to happen there. Your testing. So if you're implementing new processes and looking at the V model, you need to test those processes. Do those processes behave as I expect them to behave? And that gives you traceability. But ultimately, what that gives you too is the ability, since your process inventory remains relatively stable, it gives you a platform for building a bed of reusable regression testing scripts that align to your process. And then finally, organizational change management. So everything from, if I know I'm changing a process or I'm adding a process, what is the impact for my people? I can assess the change. I could create all the deliverables to elaborate procedures and do job aids and training, and I could build communication plans so that everyone knows once this thing happens how they need to interact with it. And then finally, at the bottom here, this process aligned status tracking is now I could report on how my project's doing in a very clear business oriented way so that my senior stakeholders know if I have 10 processes, how are my processes progressing and what they need to do to drive this change. Um, Chance mentioned. Oh, yeah. Thanks for the typo. I'll fix it in the next
We do
iteration.
have a question though. Now that
Yes.
Gary hit you on the typo. Yeah, you got to remember the type of people we have on here. Detail is everything, right, brother?
I
And
love it.
when they do a session for me, they see 1,000 typos and they just ignore it because there's so many. So, question. This is an interesting one from my perspective, being a kind of a bootstrap found startup guy. How do you think this process center strategy should be driven in startups when the agility and technology is so fast? And how to collaborate with product teams since those are the drivers of these companies, which is so true.
Yeah.
Any experience you have seen it successful on the small side?
Yeah, what's interesting is I took a flight a couple months ago and I just grabbed a book out of the airport, and it was this guy who's writing about how to do startups and how to grow your business and scale it. And he mentioned, and this guy was real small. He had one restaurant, he was successful, and he opened a second restaurant. And the second restaurant failed because he couldn't be there. And his whole point is to be able to scale, you have to write down what your processes are and then write down your expectations on those processes. His problem is he couldn't be in two places at once. And obviously he was kind of the hero method of driving that. So getting those details and being very clear on what you want on those processes, I think is very important. I think from a product management perspective, I think it's very much the same way. I think you could work with your product managers and say, okay, what products are we creating? What features are we having? And then, are we delivering to our customers? And then translate that to, okay, now what processes do I need to create to deliver on what my product managers are expecting? Hopefully that addresses that question.
Yeah, the interesting thing for me was almost like it's aspirational. Like if
Mhm.
I was in a startup and like you built your model was somewhat aspirational, right? And that's not
Yeah,
necessarily going on right now. And I
I'm doing
think
a lot of those things, but a lot of those there's a lot that are aspirational for sure.
but it's really cool that you have that model for aspiration and you can change it as it starts to come to completion, then you put
Yep.
it in the model.
Yeah. And as I hire more people now, I could say, okay, this is what I need you to do in this area. And then as they kind of develop their area, they could continue to advance it for sure.
It's almost like I would want to see this if I was giving somebody money.
Yep.
I'd want to see this model to get a better sense of where they're going and see adjustments over time from a
Yep.
startup perspective. Anyways, great stuff. Keep
Absolutely.
going.
Absolutely. Um, okay. I just want to show you this next slide, which is kind of the same thing, but just a different view, which is, if you look at, okay, now I have my in-scope processes and I colored those green. But now for a single process, and name it what you will, I have to create requirements for it. I have to do a current state and a future state process model. I need to assess it for risk and define the appropriate controls. I need to do the technology designs. I need to do my test scripts and my organizational change management. But you could see how this common language really ties everything together. And I just put some key stakeholders at the bottom, and I'm sure maybe I missed some. I mean, but what's really important about this is now I have a definition for that process. I have details on how that process works. I have all the metadata around it. Now I can be very clear with all these stakeholders, your product managers, your process owners, your IT, your testing teams, et cetera, your risk managers, what they need to do in this process. So I think it really takes everything that I said up front around, 40% of projects failed because of poor requirements and all the other issues. I think it addresses many of those challenges that I stated up front. So I'll close out with this. I think good timing. We're about 14 minutes left. I'd love the questions, and I'd love to hear more of the questions. I typically end with this, that this framework represents work. It takes an investment and it takes leadership commitment, because you do have to stand up a process capability. You do have to inventory all your processes within your organization. You do have to do the metadata alignment, et cetera, et cetera. But in my view, organizations pay for complexity. And it's one of those scenarios where you could pay upfront and get everything organized so that you could run your operation and drive change smoothly, or you could pay in the back end with lots of confusion, lots of lack of understanding how everything works, lack of spending a lot of money on investigating current state, et cetera. It's ultimately an organization's choice. I believe the best choice is to be organized, so that you could deliver that sustained success.
All right, let the questions begin. So, question number one, Christina here. You speak a lot about metadata,
Yes.
which is big for data analysis. Can you give me some examples of how you utilize the metadata? How to utilize this?
So I mentioned in these tools, they're really dynamic data platforms like Software AG, Eris, et cetera. But what they give you is the ability to slice and dice the environment and do impact analysis. So let's say you come to me and we need to replace our ERP system. It's old. It's custom built. There's customizations everywhere, et cetera. Now I could do an analysis that says, give me every process that happens on this ERP system. Now I could have a full list of processes. I could have the process owners. I could have details of how those processes work. Now, if I'm doing like an ERP replacement, now that becomes the beginning of my scope. If I'm doing a risk management, I could give me all the types of risk uh, you know uh, of type uh, Sarbanes-Oxley. Give me all the SOX risks. Well, I could understand all the processes that have SOX risks, and I could understand, okay, who needs to do validation that we're actually doing these controls, et cetera, et cetera. It really gives you the ability to slice and dice the environment in any way, shape, or possible, and that becomes super important.
All right. Where does master data management play in this model?
That's a great question. So I look at this as when I talk about metadata and all the integration, it's operational data. So it's data about what your organization does and how and what operating information and what resources that is used in this. Master data management is about the data you keep on your products, your accounts, your customers. Like, that's all important. Now there's a tie between, and if you're thinking about data governance, there's a tie between data in motion and data at rest. And to understand, and with master data management, you want to kind of have consistent locations where you manage your customer data, et cetera. But if you could tie that together, if you could understand all your processes and understand how data traverses each of those processes, and if I use a tool like what I mentioned, now I could create data objects and I could describe what data is flowing between activities. And I could tie that to my conceptual, my logical data models. And now I could tie okay, where do I have PII data like social security number? And I could tell you all the processes that use it. I could tell you where it's all stored. And I could make sure that all the appropriate PII controls are implemented. So hopefully that answers the question. There is very much a tie between operational data and master data.
All right. In your experience, is there a best practice you can speak to regarding implementing your framework?
Yeah,
For example, okay, let's see. For example, EY or City, where you had a process at a full team of folks working with these efforts with you, or were you building and leading ad hoc teams per effort, or something in between?
I think it's more you have to build a consistent team. You have to build like a process center of excellence. And that's because ultimately you need to define one set of standards for what your organization, like what a process model looks like, what a process inventory, how do you tie to capability models, et cetera. Because you want process models that come from different organizations to look the same. So you need to define your standards and enforce them. You need one repository and you need to define quality routines, which means, does this process model accurately represent what the business does? Do I have sign off? You've got to do all that data management of, you don't just integrate the master data in one-time data load, but you have to keep doing that on a periodic basis because this data changes. So I think you do need one team that does this. Now they're the facilitators of creating it, but all these models and that data is still business owned.
All right. Next question is, how does process mining play a part? Just would like to hear you speak on this and how some of your customers have done it.
It's a great question. So in my view, you can't create a full process taxonomy for what your business does using process mining, because process mining works on log files. So it'll tell you what one specific system does and maybe one process or a group of processes does. But to me, you still want to put that in context of what your business does if you're going to implement some of these larger use cases that I mentioned. So to me, and I've seen a lot of customers start to do this, is take the output of the process mining data and then resolve it back to your ground truth, which is what's your process inventory, so that you have a linkage between what my business does from a high level, from a 30,000 foot level down to a ground level, and then what process mining is finding that's happening in my systems in those log files. So I still view process inventory has to be kind of the overarching framework that you fit process mining results into.
All right. Where does this center of excellence, the process center of excellence, live
That's
within the
a
organization? On top, below the agile center of excellence, near the BA center of excellence, close to the PMO office? I'm just messing. Where would you see it living, brother?
That's a great question. So I've come across probably three or four options. So I've seen the COO, Chief Operating Officer, the IT, the CIO, the Chief Risk Officer, if it's very much a risk driven use case, or it could be transformation. I think all of those have their pros and their plus and minuses. I think from a IT perspective, I think technologists tend to think of the world in technology world through a technology lens. So I see some drawbacks there. I think it could still work. You just have to really think about that. From a risk, it's a very focused use case. To me, the ideal place is under your COO because they have responsibility for how your organization operates, and that's what this framework is dedicated to addressing.
All right. Got some answers there, big dog.
Love it.
Next question. You're still not out of the woods, man. You're earning your keep. You're earning your free. All
Keep
right.
them coming.
Is the business ultimately responsible for maintaining the process taxonomy? That's what I'm thinking about as you're talking about it.
For sure.
All right. Who gets the process document? Who yells at them to feed it, change it, adjust it? So, anyways, is the business ultimately responsible for maintaining the process taxonomy, and how are cross-functional changes communicated? Finally, is there a change governance model?
Love all of those questions. So, and I get this question a lot, and probably it's one of the first questions I probably should have addressed it earlier. But okay, you create this process taxonomy. How do you keep it up to date? My organization changes all of the time. So there's two answers to that question. One is you need to do a periodic attestation. So, responsible. That's a good word. So the COE is responsible for triggering that process, which means they have to go to the business and say, okay, let's have this discussion again. Does this still represent what you do? The business is still responsible for saying if it's accurate and if it's complete. So I think there's accountability on both sides, with the ownership of the governance process being the process capability or the process COE. The other way to do it, I think this is probably more important, is if you could embed this process structure, this process taxonomy in all those use cases that I highlighted earlier. Now you have all these stakeholders coming to you saying, I need to make sure that this is valid, and that they could spark a conversation in real time. And I think the best use case of that is if you use this for risk management. Typically teams do a yearly risk assessment. And that risk management team, the first and second line of defense, they should come to the process COE in the business and say, is this still accurate and complete? And you could do a mini validation that it is, and then they could base all their risk assessment activities off of it.
Okay. Questions continue. Do you find it is difficult to not only develop this model, but also to ensure that it's maintained? And certainly that's in my head as well.
Yeah.
Is this a change? Is this a challenge in securing consistent resources?
So I think I mentioned I addressed kind of how it's maintained. It takes some processes, and it's a combination between your kind of core process team and the business and all your other stakeholders. I'm sorry, the second part of that question, David.
Oh, crapola. Hold on a second.
Yeah.
I used the word crapola. Whoops, I used it again. All right. Do you find that it is difficult to not only develop this, which is difficult but very doable,
Yeah.
but also to ensure that it's maintained? And you kind of
Yeah.
talked about that with Chris about who owns the maintenance of it.
Yeah.
And then, so maintain it. Is this a challenge in securing consistent resources?
So I think that's where you've got to sell this to leadership, and they've got to see this as a way to address some major problems in their environment. So I've had success with this in some ways, but it is always limited in terms of how the COO or whoever's leading this buys into it. But to me, obviously you got to state the case, which I've hopefully addressed some of it here. But I think another approach is to start small. You do not have to do your entire enterprise with this. You could do one business unit and you could tackle whatever issue is most egregiously facing them. And then you could show the results in the show no, don't tell kind of model, and then expand it to other areas, but continue to show how this is delivering value, and then keep expanding until it's adopted fully across the enterprise. And then once leadership buys into it, I believe resources will be there.
And which of the departments, divisions, do you think would get the most bang from the buck in that initial deployment
Uh,
from your experience?
it depends on what the challenges are. If
Okay.
it's like if the organization's facing, like, let's say, an ERP replacement, then obviously doing finance, HR, and some of the core areas that are using those ERP systems, absolutely. If an organization's facing risk management challenges, then whatever the areas that have the most risk, that should be the focus. If there's any other large transformation change, or if there's a technology change, I think it's really where you go has to be driven by the why that's important for your context.
Mhm. Okay. What are the touch points with existing enterprise processes? In particular, two critical processes: integrated decision making, planning and budgeting, integrated execution, change, and operation.
So integrated change and operations. So I think it's all informative. So for all of those processes, I would venture to bet that giving a full and complete understanding of what the business does and how they use it from high level to low level would be advantageous for all of those processes so that they could execute more smoothly.
Okay. And so now, shouldn't the process COE be the business eventually?
Maybe, maybe not. So this is, if I think about what the business does, it typically has a leader that has P&L responsibilities, and their focus is not on do I have the right process documentation, although that's a critical enabler, but what do my customers need? Am I making money? Am I giving the right features, et cetera, et cetera? I think one downside of that approach, though, is if you're in a large organization that has many different businesses, the leaders don't roll up into kind of one business leader. They all roll up to the CEO directly. So, if you implement it in one business, but then another business wants to adopt it, then kind of traversing those kind of hierarchical lines can be a challenge.
What's the net administrative burden of the model, plus or minus?
Minus, I think. And I'll say this, creating a process inventory, while I did say it takes an interview process and it is some labor. It's really quite efficient because I'm not, and I've been involved with a lot of organizations that have created capability models, and those can turn into religious debates about what you call things. But if
Yeah.
I'm doing process inventory and I'm at an individual level asking somebody what they do, and I use their terminology, there's no debate. I just document what they say and then I move on. So creating it is actually less effort than most people would think, and maintaining it is less effort than most people would think. But I think on the flip side, the benefit from how smoothly you could run an organization across many different areas kind of far outweighs the cost and the investment that you have to put into it.
Especially in complex digital transformation. I mean, that's where
For
I'm at.
sure.
I mean, it's just not the same world anymore where there's like five technology solutions that solve five requirements. I mean, there's
Yep.
2,000 technology solutions that solve 10,000 requirements. And if you don't know what's going on within your business, then you're basically lost. And that's what you
Yeah.
see a lot
Yeah.
and hear a lot from projects and project deliverables. So
I'll,
I,
I know we're over time. I'm going to put one more real quick plug in, but AI and digital twin, I think, is going to become a hot topic. So a lot of organizations use AI as a periphery to the process. So it'll help you write an email, it'll help you read a contract. You could feed it stuff and it gives you kind of perspective. But I think the next wave is um, giving AI details on how your business operates. So all the dead bodies, all the inefficiencies, all of that stuff. So now it could take signals from how your business operates, and it could be your analyst, and it could help you identify where there's inefficiencies, where there's waste, where there's potential risks that are popping up,
yeah.
everything. But you've got to feed AI information about how your business operates.
Yeah, there's a case to be said that you can create basically a GPT for this service.
Exactly.
All right, last
Exactly.
question, then we'll close out. Folks, if you need to drop out, you hear the recording so you can catch this last question. What KPIs do you recommend for showing value resulting from the framework? Love the question.
Yeah, so I think, and I think I have a slide on here that I kind of touched on, but I think it aligns to what your why is. Why are you doing this? And then, if you're driving a large transformation, then are you hitting your budget? Are you hitting your dates? Are you delivering what your customers looking for? If you're optimizing cost, am I becoming more efficient in my use of technology and people? Employee engagement, is that coming up on satisfaction surveys? So it's a hard question to answer from a blanket perspective, other than say, there's some standard KPIs to use, but it really depends on your context.
Yeah, I got some thoughts on that too offline that we can chat about. Some really cool
Perfect.
things based on business analysis metrics and other things I've seen in this industry.
Awesome.
All
Awesome.
right. So I think, all right, one more. What is the difference between mentioned process inventory and enterprise repository? And we'll end with that one.
So process inventory is your kind of index for the process for the repository. So the repository holds all your information, but you've got to give it an index so that you could align all that metadata to. So that's kind of the tie.
Okay, well, Michael, you went 3 minutes past, but that was because people were very interested. Certainly, if they miss some of this, they get the recording, they can hear it. With that, I want to thank you for your time, your energy, your effort, and get a lot of kudos and thank yous and appreciates it and all that good stuff. And as I said, if you didn't see it, Laura Hill will send out an email with the slides, recording, and PDU codes and all that good stuff. So with that, thank you all. Have a great one.
Thank
Michael,
you.
thank
Thanks.
you. If you want to
Yeah.
give me a buzz, great.